Gibson is absolutely right about everything, but there's a few inaccuracies when it comes to his movie Braveheart. We're going to pull back the curtain and talk a little bit about the actual history of that period and of William Wallace.
In 1950, a group of 4 Scottish people snuck into Westminster Abbey and stole the Stone of Destiny, sometimes known as the Stone of Scone. It's the rock in the base of the coronation throne and a historic Scottish artifact. Now, this wasn't a group of cat burglars and this wasn't a diplomatic exchange. These were just 4 drunk hooligans who said, you know what, fuck the English, this stone belongs in Scotland. Now, the stone is a 335-pound chunk of sandstone. That's it. There's a lot of ancient symbols of Scottish culture, but this one somehow inspired a group of drunks to drive down to London in the middle of the winter and, showing the artifact a spiritual reverence, pry it out with a crowbar.
They're practical people, this guy.
Yes, they are. Now, at some point, the stone breaks in two after they drop it on the ground. It's not clear if these guys broke it or if it was already broken from age and being very close to a bombing committed by the suffragettes a decade earlier. En route to Scotland, the small piece falls out of the car, and the big piece is at one point used as a toboggan because, again, they got drunk. Also, at some point, they decided to bury a hole and hide it in the ground, and a group of gypsies built a camp on top of it. So
we got to do a whole podcast on the gypsies.
Yes, we do. Yes, we do. Now, when questioned afterwards, they admitted that they really weren't quite sure what they were going to do after they stole it. They just hadn't thought that far ahead. But eventually they leave it at the ruins of Arbroath Abbey, north of Edinburgh, where the Scots, at least according to conventional history, declared their independence from England. So they leave a damaged piece of rock draped in the Scottish flag, and it's promptly returned to England. Ian Hamilton, who was the ringleader of this little scheme, was a student and he was part of the Home Rule movement. Say what you will about him, he is emblematic of a certain little slice of Scottish culture. Fiercely nationalistic, especially about his ancestors. Sometimes this manifests itself as a fierce independence, sometimes it manifests itself as fierce loyalty to the crown. It would be nice if the history of Scotland could be reduced to a nice, simple, mostly linear narrative that explains why this chunk of rock is so important. But things aren't that simple. The United States has it down to a fine art where they have the mythos behind the American Revolution, where it becomes a narrative of taxes, the Boston Tea Party, war breaking out, Declaration of Independence, George Washington, British surrender, Constitution. The Scots don't have any sort of a clean narrative like that. At best, it's a full season of Game of Thrones where one cousin is constantly killing another cousin to take the throne, only to then be killed on the battlefield himself.
But a horrible tribal mess, and then basically no one can read or write.
Yep,
so trying to sort that out.
Yeah, that's basically what happens, and plus when you go back far enough, it's hard to tell what is real, what is oral tradition that's maybe not reliable, and what becomes pure legend when you go back far enough. All we really have to go on is some very, let's say, unreliable record, and it doesn't help matters that Scottish nationalism has been, let's say, colored by a certain Mel Gibson movie in the 1990s.
It blows my mind the impact of mass media on culture and cultural mythos and like the zeitgeist of a group of people. It's just the importance of media again and again and again. Just blows my mind.
Today we're going to be debunking some things in the movie Braveheart, and when I say some things, Braveheart was an epic story, but there was about zero historical fact that goes into that movie.
I'm going to go on record saying I don't believe Mel Gibson would lie about anything.
Well, Mel Gibson is in fact maybe a little too honest about certain things. But the interesting thing is, even if you take the movie Braveheart at its face, and it resolves with Robert the Bruce taking the throne of Scotland, the cousin killing doesn't stop there. It keeps going forward. When the story, before the movie Braveheart starts, you have cousins killing each other for the throne. After the movie ends, you have cousins killing each other for the throne. So why is it that this one specific period in history evokes so many emotions? When the story of Scotland starts, the idea of Scotland doesn't even exist. You have Picts, you have Celts, you have Gaels, you have Vikings, you have people from the borderlands who eventually become English.
We really forget how monolithic our culture is.
Yeah.
You grew up in the West. It's so weird. In North America, you can get in a plane, you can fly 7 hours, you can get off the plane, and the people will have the same accent you have.
Yeah, exactly.
It's weird, and it's like a fish doesn't know it's wet. It's very hard for us to kind of conceive that other people are going to have different ideas about that. Classic example, when I was getting to know people from Afghanistan or Iraq, what's Afghanistan and what's Iraq? I'm loyal to my tribe, my family, my religion. And yeah, that's so in a pre-federal state, this is what matters to people.
Well, what is Afghanistan? It's been called the graveyard of empires. Graveyard of at least 3 empires I can name, and probably more than that.
Yeah, the Chinese are going to give it a go. You watch.
Yeah, they are. We're going to, first of all, debunk Braveheart, but we're also not going to just turn this into a string of then Angus MacPherson kills Hamish MacDonald. It's easy to go too far in the opposite direction and look at the chronicles and say the history of Scotland is just one king of Scotland killing another king of Scotland, who kills another king of Scotland, who kills another king of Scotland, ad infinitum. We're going to really try to look at how the concept of a nation arises from this, I don't want to call it chaos. The precursors to the Scottish were not quite as barbaric as we sometimes like to think they were. They were just a lot of tribes often on the coastland of Scotland, and they traded with continental powers. There was Roman pottery found in certain Scottish settlements. Of course, the Romans were not able to take over Scotland, but that's something we'll get to very, very shortly. But at some point, out of all of this chaos, emerges this concept of the nation where everybody knows who is and who isn't a Scot. So let me ask you this. What do you know about Scotland?
Let's see. Train spotting, the Loch Ness Monster, haggis,
Yep.
and my grandmother was a Scot, so we always celebrated Robbie Burns Day. And I complained at one point that our tartan was drab, and my grandma, who was a very proper, kind of upper class lady, said to me, "Well, Jeremy, traditionally it always had the blood of an enemy on it," so it was very...
Yep, that's all consistent with the idea of Scotland, I know. If we're going to look at the common mythology that these people all share, we're going to have to go right back to the Roman Empire. The Romans used the term Caledonia to refer to the part of Britain that was north of the River Forth. The term Caledonia is now informally used to refer to all of Scotland, especially in poems and songs and stuff. But specifically, it refers to the part of the island that's north of what's now Glasgow and Edinburgh.
Okay.
The Romans tried several times to take over Britain. Julius Caesar, the greatest conqueror of all time, fails twice. There's a lot of folk stories about this. Don't know how much truth there is to any of them, but in any case, Julius Caesar takes over Gaul, i.e. France. He takes over England, and he gets to Scotland and tries twice and decides to turn around.
This is still a point of pride.
Yes, it
The
is.
Scottish people. We were such savages. The Romans couldn't even take us over and civilize us.
Yep. No, the Greeks are proud of inventing democracy. The Italians are proud of being the birthplace of the Renaissance. The Scottish are proud of their barbarism. Fast forward about a century and a half after Julius Caesar, we have another man named Agricola. He was the governor of Britain, or as they called it, Britannia, in AD 78. He crushes the Welsh and he decides to go north and take over the rest of the island. And as I said, this story is probably more myth than reality, but there comes a point where the island becomes narrow and it's a bit of a choke point, and the Romans just can't get any farther. The Roman historian Tacitus writes about a certain battle, and this is probably just Roman propaganda to make the battle seem like an epic battle where the Romans prevail. But the Caledonians are led by a warrior named Calgacus, which translates as the swordsman. Now, the Romans give Calgacus a monologue that almost sounds straight out of Shakespeare. He talks about the last men on earth. He talks about how the Caledonians are the last of the free. It probably is just fan fiction, giving Agricola a worthy opponent to defeat. But in any case, Agricola does win this battle, but he's then called back to Rome. So, is it really a victory? Does it really matter when a country's national mythos is based around it? It's one of the challenges when you really dig into a culture's history. We like to think that there's a nice narrative that things slowly build on themselves to eventually become a civilization that's some level of advanced. But a lot of things are just, you'd almost say, pure luck like this. If Agricola hadn't been called back to Rome, there's a very good chance he would have pushed himself all the way to the north of the island, and the Romans would have made what's now Scotland a little bit more civilized. In fact, there probably wouldn't be a Scottish people that was distinct from the Romanized English, or at least the Romanized people who became the English. This is the first of, I'm going to say, 3 Deus Ex Machinas, 3 very fortunate events to befall the story of the Scottish people, or the precursors to the Scottish people. If these 3 things hadn't happened, if history had gone a little bit differently, the culture in the north half of Great Britain would be a little bit different. So the first one of these Deus Ex Machinas is Agricola being called back to Rome. It's an interesting question. Can a nation form without some of these stories that we're trying to deconstruct? If the primitive people who eventually become the Scottish people, if they really knew the truth behind these stories, would the common culture have even formed in the first place? I don't know. It's just an interesting question to think about. Especially because the southern tribes who were in what's now Scotland, they were already Romanized, so it's not like the idea of Romanizing the north half of Scotland was completely out of the question. The other thing you have to remember is the idea of being a fierce warrior people on the outskirts of an empire. There are very diminishing marginal returns to pushing the borders of an empire even farther out, especially in a place like the north half of Great Britain where the farmland isn't terribly arable. If the Romans had wanted to expand their empire somewhere else, there's probably more bang for your buck if you push out into other parts of Europe and North Africa.
You don't want to farm crags.
Exactly. In fact, even if it's not just about the natural resources, sometimes there's a border skirmish in a more valuable part of the empire, and the emperor just needs those resources. He needs his army, he needs his troops in other places more, so sometimes they'll just not focus on a certain border skirmish that they don't find as crucial. So as much as we would like to say that the Scottish stood up to the most civilized empire that the world had ever seen at that point, the most terrifying army that the world had ever seen, it's a lot less impressive when you put it on in context and you realize it's just the outskirts of a large sprawling empire with a lot of other things to do. Now, that said, the Caledonians still were a pain in the ass for the Roman squatters at the northern fringes of the empire, and in AD 122, an emperor named Hadrian says, you know what, I've had it with trying to deal with these savages, I'm building a wall.
When the Scots send their people, they're not sending their best.
Yeah.
They're sending their problems, their rapists.
Yep. Yep, that's basically how it went.
This is another thing that the Scots are still very proud of. They had to build a fucking wall.
Yep. Yeah. Hadrian's Wall was, it wasn't like the Great Wall of China. It had openings in it. Why? Because there was still commerce and trading that went on between, let's say, England and Scotland. They weren't England and Scotland in those days. And also having a few checkpoints or choke points in the middle of the wall, it makes it a lot easier to impose tariffs and taxes. So it wasn't Hadrian's Wall, as much as we like to think of it as a border between civilization and barbarism. It also did serve its commercial purposes for the empire, especially vis-a-vis raising taxes. But you know what? We asked earlier, what causes a people? What causes a common culture? A people really requires geography to grow their identity. And some people will say otherwise. I just don't agree with that. The Americans had the Atlantic coast and the frontier, both of which play large parts in the American mythos. Australia has the outback. Canada has building a railroad across a large desolate continent. The Scots have this area where Great Britain becomes a little bit narrower and it's really, really hard to pass. And that little area, just that one little choke point where the Romans just could never make it all the way to the north of the island, this is something that looms large in the Scottish ethos. But who are the people north of Hadrian's Wall? Well, the Romans called them the Picts. Pict is it's like calling a German a kraut. It was not exactly a descriptive or a complimentary word to refer to these people.
Not PC.
No. Well, do you really think the Romans were PC people? No, I don't
You don't
either.
live an empire on PC shit.
They were called the Picts because they were painted. You think of them as the warrior society. Again, we're talking about Braveheart. Mel Gibson paints himself in blue paint. This is at least 1,000 years anachronistic. Also, I mean, the kilts were also 500 years too early in Braveheart. So yeah, he's wearing face paint that's 1,000 years too late and kilts that are like 500 years too early. But you know what? Who cares? He's telling a story.
It's like Abraham Lincoln with a samurai sword and a machine gun.
Hunting vampires, right?
Hunting vampires, exactly.
The Picts were the people in the northeastern part of Britain, but they weren't the only group of people who lived north of the wall. You also had some Celtic tribes who were a little bit more Romanized. You also had the Gaels, who we don't completely know where they originate from, but most likely they came over from Ireland. And the Gaelic people were called the Scotti by the Romans. Now, Scotti is also like calling a German a kraut. Scotti essentially means pirate or marauder, so that'll let you know what they thought of the people coming over from Ireland.
Yeah.
Can you imagine there was a time when people viewed the Irish as uncivilized?
That would be just unthinkable.
Yeah.
It's always been such a bastion of progress.
Mm-hmm. Now, it's completely lost to myth, but according to legend, there was a king named Fergus who came over from Ireland and established the Gaelic kingdom called Dalriada. There is one big difference, though, between the Gaels and the Picts, even though they do have similar genetics, and that's that the Gaels were Christians. The Catholic missionaries had gone over to Ireland, and they had built their monasteries and ministered to the Irish people before they came over to the west coast of Scotland. When they come over, they establish a monastery at Iona, which is a major outpost of the Catholic Church for a few centuries. This is where they write the famous Book of Kells, which ends up in Dublin.
Yep.
The other group of people you have in the area, even though they never end up becoming Scottish, they're the Angles. They come over from Germany after the fall of the Roman Empire, and they move into what's now Northumberland, which is the northeastern part of England, or at least the northeastern part of modern England. The Picts and the Angles are constantly trying to steal each other's land. This is a running theme that you'll hear a lot of. You'll hear a lot of Picts and later on Scots trying to invade the northern part of England because they would like a chunk of this land, and the other way around. That's just tribal stuff. Even though the Angles never end up becoming part of Scotland, you essentially have these four groups of people. You have the Picts, the Gaels, the Celts, and the Angles, and even though they're four separate peoples, they all have nobility who intermarry a lot. So when we're talking about the old nobles and kings there's very, very good chance a lot of these royals have blood from all four of these groups. The fifth group, which completes the picture here, is the Vikings. They come over from Norway. They take the northwest coast of Britain and some of the islands. This is where the monastery at Iona is abandoned, and this is why the Book of Kells is taken across the Irish Sea to Dublin for safekeeping. So this is where we're going to set the stage when the history of Scotland really starts. We have these five groups of people: Picts, Gaels, Celts, Angles, and Vikings. This is where the history of Scotland really, really starts.
We set the stage for a unified group of people with no intertribal issues.
We'll set the stage for a group of people who eventually becomes unified. We're going to have to go through quite a bit to get to that point.
It's a learning process.
The man who is traditionally considered the first king of Scotland is a man named Kenneth MacAlpin. He is sometimes called the first king of Scotland. He's not the king of Scotland. He's only ever referred to as a king of the Picts. You still have all these five different groups when Kenneth MacAlpin wears the King of Pictland. But why is it important? It's because he's from Dalriada. He is Gaelic himself. So this is the first sort of unification, and this is maybe why he's sometimes called the first king of Scotland. But I'd say in reality, it's just when you go any farther back than Kenneth, the records just aren't reliable. Even the person who he inherited the crown from may not have even been a real person. It might have been a legendary person. So I'd say part of it is the unification of the Gaelic royalty and the Pictish royalty, but a bigger part of it is, you'll notice this is where a lot of European chronicles start. Charlemagne is considered the first king of France in the 9th century. Ethelstan is considered the first king of England in the 10th century. Aragon starts in the 10th century. Castile starts in the 11th century. The Norman conquest is 1066. Why do all the European countries seem to start around this time? Well, it's because this is the time nobility really becomes literate.
Okay.
Before that, the nobility was just as illiterate as the peasantry, and it was pure power politics. One king took over another patch of land and defended the borders by force, and that was what gave him legitimacy. After the nobility became literate, you started having to, justify why you were entitled to this little tract of land. But even though it was very much a medieval time, even though it was still largely an oral tradition, everybody understood at this point, if you wanted to be the king, you had to have some blood in common with the previous royal. And everybody understood that the crown was never going to be passed from, at least, it wasn't a given that the crown was going to be passed from father to son. Why? Because this was a very tribal, warlike land, and if one king got killed in battle, it was very, very likely that his offspring were quite young and nobody wanted to give the crown to a 3-year-old. If we know nothing else about this time, because the records are not terribly reliable, we know that there was a lot of killing going on. We know that it was total Game of Thrones stuff. And we know that no matter what happened, it was up to the royal family to decide which member of the family was the most appropriate person to wear the crown. So you'll see a lot of the crown passing from brother to brother, or grandfather to grandson, or cousin to cousin, or uncle to nephew, or any other familial relation. But it's very, very rare that you're going to see the crown directly inherited, because that's just not the way things were done then. And it's important because this wasn't written, but everybody understood it. And this is something very important for a common culture to be arising. You don't need to have things written down. You don't need to have a written constitution that everybody agrees to follow. Just the laws of nature or tacit understandings between people, that's more than enough to keep traditions going throughout the centuries.
Absolutely.
Kenneth, even though we don't really know much about the guy, there are certainly some legends about him. One of the most famous legends is that he was a Gaelic guy who got the crown of the Picts by inviting all of the Pictish nobles and the king to a big banquet and getting his men to dig a bunch of trenches with a bunch of spikes in them and build the tables and the benches over top of this, and then when everybody got drunk, they would Kenneth's men just cut the supports out from underneath the benches and everybody falls into the pit. Probably didn't happen, probably just a folk tale or a story, but man, the Scottish had a completely different set of fairy tales than I grew up with.
Yeah.
This is
like their pikes.
Yep, that they do. Most likely he just killed the king and the nobles of the Picts, and this had to be dramatized somehow, but who knows what happened. This supposedly happens at Scone, and why do I say Scone? That's where the rock, the Stone of Scone, comes from, or the Stone of Destiny. For the next several centuries, Scone is the capital of, well, let's say Pictland, it's not Scotland yet. According to tradition, Scone is the center of the Scottish monarchy and the Scottish proto-government. This is where, when the nobles or the clergy need to get together and have an important council or parliament, it happens at Scone. And if two cousins disagree on who should inherit the throne, if one person cuts off the other person's head and gets to Scone first, that person would be crowned by the probably the clergy. Later on it was the Earl of Fife. So if Kenneth was just the king of Pictland, where does this idea of Scotland come in? As I said, I don't want this to just become a bunch of so-and-so kills so-and-so kills so-and-so. It's easy to fall into that little rabbit hole. But the important thing is that there still are two separate cultures. There's the Gaelic culture and the Pictish culture. So we're going to start with one Gaelic king named Giric, who usurps the crown from a Pictish king named Aeth. It's probably a coup, but keep in mind this is just completely normal in those days for one person to say, hey, I want the crown, I'm going to kill you for it. And we do have a list of kings in the Chronicles, but again, it's scarce and unreliable. But whatever happens, Giric, the Gaelic guy, comes in and replaces the court and the bishops with Gaels. But unfortunately for Giric, there are two young Picts who are grandsons of the previous king, and he wasn't able to completely snuff out the bloodline, so they get courted off to Ireland. But Ireland is Gaelic itself, so even though these two boys are Picts, they eventually grow up, come back to Pictland. Giric has to pay the piper and get murdered by these two cousins. When I said these two kids were grandsons, they're cousins, they're not brothers. Okay. So the House of Alpine continues. They're raised, they come back, they murder Garrick, but they were raised in a Gaelic court. And after Pictland had a Gaelic king who had replaced all the Pictish nobles with Gaels, you have the proper Pictish kings, but they were raised in the Gaelic traditions. And they reigned for, I think, 50 years between them. I think one for 10 years, one for 40 years. So even though the Picts technically win, they're the last ones standing, you've got something like 75 years of an elite, a nobility that are culturally Gaelic, and the Pictish traditions just kind of fade away. The Gaelic traditions start to dominate, and now you just have one culture that encompasses both the former kingdom of Dalriada and the former kingdom of Pictland. Interestingly, centuries later, a monk named Robert of Poppleton commissions a bunch of scribes to collect and copy various old documents, and one of which is called the Chronicle of the Kings of Alba. Alba's a new name that we haven't come across yet. This is important because when the first of these two cousins, King Donald, dies, he's not referred to as the king of the Gaels, he's not referred to as the king of Pictland, he is referred to the king of Alba. In fact, by the end of his reign, all references to Pictland disappear, and all these references are just references to Alba, or if they're in Latin, Albanium. His cousin, after he dies, the other one of these two grandsons, he is the first king who we have a record of being crowned at Scone. He probably was the first king who sat on this stone that the Scottish hooligans would steal more than a millennium later. This is really the first time you have a kingdom that you could say is a proto-Scottish people. From this point forward, they don't call themselves Picts to make the Gaels pissed off. They don't call themselves Gaels to make the Picts pissed off. They just decide to call themselves something completely new. They decide to call themselves the Kingdom of Alba. But, kingdoms do unite all the time. There's nothing terribly special about this. And as I said, you still have Britons in what's called Strathclyde. I guess when I say Britons, Celts in Strathclyde. You still have the Vikings. But more importantly, this is where the antagonist enters the story. Because you didn't just have a unification of two major kingdoms in what's now Scotland, you also had a unification of kingdoms in what's now England. And if you know one thing about Scottish people, there's a lot of Scottish people, including some in my own family, who have some very, very, let's say, vociferous opinions about what the English are like.
Well,
yes. Athelstan is sometimes called the first king of the English, and he wanted all of Britain, so he decided to push north. Constantine, who was the second one of these two cousins, he has to make a quick decision if he wants to defend his land against a much bigger and much more united army. So what does he do? He does the unexpected. He makes an alliance with both the Celts and the Vikings against the English. And this is essentially a replay of what happens back in the Roman days. There is a large battle called the Battle of Brunanburh. We don't know where this battle exactly took place, but just as it was where the Romans couldn't push any farther north, it's where the English can't push any farther north. Now, strictly speaking, the Battle of Brunanburh was a win for the English, but the Scottish and the Vikings and the Celts had done them so much damage that Athelstan decided it wasn't worth it to go any farther north. And as far as Scottish national pride goes, that's good enough.
It's a bit of a Slavic victory.
Yeah, exactly. We're going to jump a little bit forward because kings come and go and the common man doesn't know any better. As far as the common man is concerned, he's just going about his daily business in some rainy, depressing fishing village on the North Sea coast.
Catching salmon, trading it for oats.
Yeah, basically. growing sheep, making haggis, whatever they did. And at some point out of this, a king named Malcolm II dies with 2 grandsons named Duncan and Macbeth.
I think I've heard about this guy.
Yes. Now, the actual story of Macbeth really isn't terribly important to the history of Scotland. When James I, who was a Scottish king, becomes King of England centuries later, Shakespeare wants to get in his good graces by writing a play about Scotland, and James was into a bunch of witch hunting and occult stuff, so the bard decided to make witches and witchcraft an important theme in that play. But as far as the historical Macbeth goes, it's not terribly important, other than the fact that after Macbeth kills his cousin Duncan and is then killed by another cousin, or I think a descendant of Duncan named Malcolm the Great Chief, or Malcolm Canmore. This establishes the Canmore dynasty, which will control Scotland for the next several hundred years. This is a dynasty that it lasts centuries, but it also underscores the concept of legitimacy with a nobility who's newly literate, because before this point, the idea of having a dynasty that lasts 200 or 300 years just would have been unheard of. But something very important happens here, and it's not within the borders of Scotland. You have to take a look at world history as a whole. You have the Norman invasion. William the Conqueror comes over, the Normans take over England. Malcolm is allied, I think possibly through marriage, to the old Anglo-Saxon kings who the Normans kicked off the throne. So the Scots decide we're going to honor this alliance, and we're going to march down and show this William the Conqueror French guy who's boss, and they get their clock cleaned. This is, as much as Scottish mythology is, we've kicked the English ass a whole bunch of times because, they may be a bunch of effete cultured people, we have brute strength. The English defeat the Scottish a lot. This is one of many times that it happens, and it's after the Scottish king is forced to cry mercy. The treaty is called the Treaty of Abernethy, or sometimes called the Abernethy Submission. This is the first of several of these treaties that the Scottish are forced to sign in their humiliation. One of the things that Malcolm has to do is give up his oldest son to the English court so that he'll be raised in England, and more importantly, so that if this son never becomes King of Scotland, he'll be an ally of the English king.
That same kind of thing where buddy was, if they want to raise him, just like he was Celtic.
Exactly. It's kind of a foreign concept these days. Like, why wouldn't you just be on the side of your father? But this is just, in those days, you're loyal to whichever court you grew up in.
And Byron goes back to the hand that rocks the cradle.
Yeah, exactly. And again, it's not like it was unusual in those days. It's just how it worked. It was just what everybody expected. Malcolm and his wife, they have 5 or 6 children, and they become quite intertwined with the new British royal family, the Normans. One marries Henry I, one marries Henry's daughter, one dies without heirs, but when Malcolm Canmore dies, he passes the throne to his brother, but the King of England decides, I'd rather get my tentacles into Scotland. They send this prince north, the one who had been raised in England, and within a few months, this new King of Scotland is murdered by the people who are loyal to the well, let's say loyal to more local factions, then they don't really want to be a vassal of England. There's another couple of kings who ascend to the Scottish throne, but they die without heirs until you get one named King David. David, even though he wasn't raised in the English royal court the way that his brother Duncan was, David was still raised in the new Norman ways. So not the English ways, the ways of the new French aristocracy who had just come over with William the Conqueror. And when he becomes King of Scotland, a lot of these old Norman ways come into Scotland as well. A very important family, the Bruce family, they're a family of French nobles who come into Scotland with King David. But the important thing, though, is that the Norman conquest, the old French aristocratic ways, they don't just come into England. They seep all the way north into Scotland without a battle.
Cultural diffusion.
Well, it's not just cultural diffusion. Cultural diffusion is sometimes
things
talked about.
Happening.
Well, things naturally happen at the level of the peasantry. I mean, I'm talking about the nobility.
Very specifically doing something to change the culture that then diffuses down.
Yes. Oh, well, culture always comes from the top down. A bunch of French aristocrats get a bunch of land in Scotland, and then the elites who are not noble, they are going to want to at least ingratiate themselves to the new aristocracy.
They want to get invited to the good parties.
Exactly. As I said, this is where the Bruce family comes in, and this is a name you'll be hearing later on in our story. This is a name you hear in the movie Braveheart. And this is also where Strathclyde, which were the remaining Celts, this is where they get incorporated into the rest of Scotland because David was a huge landowner. I think the English king had granted him the lands of Strathclyde. So this is the next missing ethnic group that is now part of the modern Scots. There wasn't a war or something which they were conquered by the rest of the Scots. They're just brought in with this new king who's a gigantic landowner who brings in the Celts as well as a bunch of French nobles.
Talk about material forces.
Well, of course, I mean, yeah, that's just the way of the world.
Yep.
The idea of something happening from the bottom up, just a bunch of Scottish barbarians on the moors, it's a nice story to think of the king arising from nothing, but that's just not how it happens. It's not how it's ever happened anywhere. Another king named William the Lion, who was the grandson of King David, takes the throne. And once again, he tries to take Northumbria, first by pestering Henry II, who is by now the king, and then by trying to invade. And it's just a running motif throughout the history of Scotland that they keep trying to invade Northumberland and keep failing. This happens long after the story ends that I'm going to be telling today. This happens...
Every country has its own sensible.
Yes.
It's
Yes.
just...
But I'm saying, when you think about the English Civil War, which happened centuries later, it happens because the King of England has to raise an army to fight the Scots, because the Scots are still trying to take this little patch of land in the north of England. So this is something that's going to keep happening, and it's going to keep happening long after we're finished this podcast.
Yeah. Talk about cultural residues.
Yes. William the Lion is eventually captured in one of these failed attempts to take Northumberland. He has to sign the Treaty of Falaise, where the English king makes him admit, okay, you're going to be a vassal, you're going to be subordinate to England from now on if you want to get out of this cage. eventually signs it and agrees to pay homage to the English king, but this is promptly overturned because there's another one of these major world events going on called the Crusades. Again, you can't just look at all this Game of Thrones stuff as a closed system where cousins are constantly killing each other. Scotland is just not a significant enough country on the world stage to be immune to, or even to be a trendsetter. They are, at the end of the day, at the mercy of these huge geopolitical shifts that are happening. And in this case, Richard the Lionheart wants to go on a crusade. He needs money for the crusades, and one of the ways he gets this money is by selling Scotland their independence back. So Scotland does get their independence at the quitclaim of Canterbury. I have no idea how you pronounce quitclaim, but let's go with that. And this treaty actually will come into play a little bit farther on in our story, and that's why I'm mentioning it here. But this is the second time that the Scots have taken on the English, lost badly, and had to sign a humiliating treaty.
The theme in European history.
Yes, it is. So what's the first thing that happens after Richard the Lionheart sells Scotland its independence back? Well, they start trying to invade Northumberland again.
It's kind of like a Gaza situation.
Kind of, yeah. The King Richard the Lionheart is being killed on the Crusades by this point. It's not that it's relevant to this story, but he decided to wander outside of his tent at night and got hit by a stray arrow, which just don't do that if you ever find yourself on a medieval crusade.
Stay in the tent.
Yes.
It's nighttime.
Yes. But his brother King John, who, if you've read any Robin Hood stories, he's the villain in most of the Robin Hood legends. He has to sign yet another treaty of defeat with the Scots, and King William of the Scottish has to give off both of his daughters to be raised in England again. He was hoping that one of these daughters would be married into the royal family, but unfortunately it's not to be. They're both married off to high-ranking nobles, but that's not good enough. Well, close only counts in horseshoes, right?
Yep.
So this has set the stage. We started with a lot of Game of Thrones stuff, a lot of cousins killing each other for the throne of these various kingdoms, which eventually coalesced into Scotland. We then had the House of Canmore, which tried for centuries to take Northumberland and continually failing and getting forced to sign humiliating treaties by the King of England. But what we haven't seen yet is a Scottish cultural ethos really start to coalesce. In fact, up until this point, believe it or not, even with all the wars going back and forth, the Scottish and the English get along quite well. Yes, they're constantly going to war with each other, trying to screw their cousins out of their inheritance, but this just happens everywhere in the Middle Ages. It's
business as usual.
Not even business as usual, just family matters as usual. But here's where we come to a king who becomes a major turning point in our story. This is King Alexander II. This is I think the 1200s by this point. He is the first king since Kenneth MacAlpin to have inherited the crown from his father.
Wow.
Just
a contentious group
yes,
of people.
yes, we are. Just in case you want to know, what kind of a martial culture existed north of the border. In fact, it existed south of the border as well, but when William the Conqueror comes over and imposes the old French aristocratic rules on England, they formalize their rules of inheritance a little bit more in England. In Scotland, I guess because the Normans had come up into Scotland, it becomes you start to see a little bit more fathers passing on their land or their crowns to their sons because of the French influence. But you still, at the end of the day, have cousins trying to kill each other for the throne, and if one cousin kills another cousin, grabs the crown and gets to Scone first to be crowned, he is going to be considered the King of Scotland. But we still have a few loose ends that need to be tied up. The first is that the Vikings, we haven't gotten rid of them yet. They're still fucking around on the northwest coast of the island. And the second loose end that still needs to be tied up is that the king still does have his cousins who are contending with him for the throne. And after one of these clans, the McWilliams, decide to really challenge King Alexander II for the throne, he puts them down quite violently, including gathering everybody into this town square as he brutally beats the clan head's infant daughter to death in front of everybody, literally smashing her head on a stone.
You ever read Blood Meridian?
Yes, I have. Some peoples just need to get the message in a way that leaves no room for ambiguity, and smashing the clan head's infant's daughter's head on a rock is one way of doing that.
You talk about smashing the altar?
Yeah.
That's smashing the altar.
Yes, it is. So after that point, say what you will about King Alexander, yes, there's always going to be clans in a tribal group of people who would love to get their hands on the throne, but this establishes the King of Scotland as somebody who you might have a better time getting in his good graces of than trying to challenge him. So first of all, you had the Vikings. Second of all, you had these other clans. And the third of all, King Alexander starts really throwing his weight around politically and gets involved in a bunch of foreign treaties. In fact, the original Magna Carta that gets presented to King John has a clause in it that says you're going to do right by Alexander II of Scotland. That's actually what it said, one of the original clauses in the Magna Carta. Now, if you know anything about British history, the Magna Carta goes through a couple of revisions, and this doesn't end up in the parchment that we revere today.
Ends up on the cutting room floor.
It ends up on the cutting room floor, yes. But England descends into a civil war, so what does Alexander do? He decides to invade Northumberland again. And Carlisle, for good measure. Northumberland is in the northeast part of England. Carlisle is in the northwest. And because England is descending into civil war, a lot of the English nobles in the north part of the country, instead of fighting back, they actually swear their allegiance to Alexander. So why doesn't this quite work out? Something always goes wrong at the last minute here when the Scots try to take Northumberland. This time they didn't just take it, they had the nobility pledging fealty to them. Because King John had pissed off the nobles of England, the nobles of England had decided that they wanted to depose him. They raised an army and offered the throne of England to the French Prince Louis. So Louis comes over from France with this army intending to depose the King of England. Alexander of the Scots marches south, intending to make good with this new French prince. He says, as soon as you take over the throne of England, you're going to recognize me as the undisputed king of Northumberland, right? Right? Unfortunately, King John dies of dysentery.
Oh.
Centuries before Argonne Trail. And he passes on the crown to a new English king, and the English nobility says, you know what, now that this asshole is dead, we don't really need to have a civil war anymore, so we're just going to support the King of England. And the King of Scotland goes, fuck! Best laid plans, right? So
No match for dysentery.
by my count, this is like 4 times that the Scottish have tried to invade Northumberland, and this is 4 times that they've failed. Henry III, as I said, he signs with the real Magna Carta, the Magna Carta that essentially becomes the foundation of English common law, but Clause 59, the one that talks about doing right by King Alexander, it's not in there anymore. And for good measure, for trying these shenanigans, the Pope excommunicates the King of Scotland as well. And this isn't just like getting kicked out of your church these days where you have to go across the road to a new church. It's a big deal politically getting excommunicated by the Pope.
Yep. You go to hell.
Yep.
Yeah.
Yep. But everything we've talked about here is still in the realm of the political. Where does the Scottish culture start to coalesce, or at least where do we start to get a culture that sort of looks like modern Scottish? I use modern in quotation marks as this is still the 13th century. Well, the nobility of Scotland are largely Normans, largely French, the Scottish elites. There were a lot of old nobility from the old Gaelic and Celtic cultures. They had just kind of been pushed aside because they were never as wealthy or powerful as the French guys who came in, but Alexander really does make an effort to bring Celtic people into his court, bring Gaelic people into his court, to create a new culture that's not just an out-of-touch French elite and a whole bunch of peasants covered in shit. Okay. He tries to create a culture that the peasants can look up to. And this, I would say, is a prerequisite for any culture that's going to last for any amount of time. Every culture is going to have its elite, but a good culture has an elite who people want to look up to and people want to admire, and an elite that take this role very, very seriously.
If you have unimpressive elites, your society is in trouble.
Why would that be relevant to the modern era? So, Alexander also, trying to make good with the English, does marry the King of England's sister at this point. He also tries to get back in the Pope's good graces, so he asks for the Pope's blessing. But he still wants the Church to say that the Church of Scotland is equal to the Church of England and the Church of France. He wants the Pope to say that the Church of Scotland is not going to be managed by way of England. And this is something that absolutely will come into play when we start debunking the movie Braveheart, which I know we're in like 45 minutes into this and haven't gotten to yet.
We promise, guys, we'll get to Braveheart.
We will get to Braveheart, but this is important.
You gotta lay the foundation. You gotta have the context.
Well, like I said, this attempt to get the Church to say that this attempt to get the Pope to say that the Church of Scotland is on equal footing with the Church of England and the Church of France is extremely important context for what's coming next. Once again, the king has to sign another humiliating treaty, this time called the Treaty of York, once again agreeing that he's not going to have any claims on Northumberland. But part of this treaty finalizes the border between the rivers Tweed and the River Solway, which are more or less the common borders of Scotland today. As I said, every people needs some plot of land that they feel some sort of deep connection to, and having a firm, well-established border is an important step towards that.
What do you have? You don't have a border.
Yeah, exactly.
You have no rule of law.
Exactly. So if Alexander does two things that really help create the culture that becomes the Scottish culture, he establishes the borders and he makes sure that the old Gaelic culture has a say at the table, has a spot at the table. The table is not just run by a bunch of out-of-touch French aristocrats.
Imagine an elite that doesn't want to be out of touch.
Yeah, well, that's why I read a lot of history, because it sometimes you need to be reminded that the way things are right now, it's not normal and it's not right.
Yeah.
Alexander dies shortly after this, and he still hasn't kicked out the Vikings yet. That's the one last loose end which we haven't tied up. Alexander dies essentially in preparation for battle. He is succeeded by his 7-year-old son, Alexander III. But unfortunately, this was not by the King of England's sister. He had tried marrying the king's sister to hope to make some strategic alliances. She died without giving him an heir, so he married a French princess who gave him an heir, but unfortunately the new young King Alexander III was not allied with the King of England, unfortunately. That might have made the next couple centuries of Scottish history go very, very differently if Alexander had been given an heir through his English wife, not through his French wife. Again, Game of Thrones stuff.
Yep.
This is where we start debunking the movie Braveheart. I've yada-yada'd a lot of stuff up to this point, but we've had to set the stage. But the first thing I have to talk about is the second Deus Ex Machina. I talked about the first one was when Agricola had to be called back to Rome. The second one is when when the Scottish king is preparing for a battle with the Vikings, pisses off the King of Norway. The King of Norway sends a fleet down, and the fleet is just wrecked by a storm. And the king,
kamikaze.
basically, yes. The King of Norway says, you know what, why do we have all these Vikings we have to protect with our military? Do we really want to have this stuff anymore? Just buy the land back, have the rest of Scotland. So
Scotland has a real Afghanistan vibe.
yeah, it does.
So this
Well, but
portion of history, a lot of people are like, you know what, I'm not dealing with this. We're going, oh.
But the thing is, a real question is how far can you deconstruct a people's history? Because if the common man in Scotland really knew all these details about how their land coalesced not by a bunch of battles, but by a bunch of treaties, and the Vikings just saying, fuck it, we're out of here, would it have really developed into the same culture? I don't know. It's just an open question. But one very, very fortunate turn of events just resolves everything with the Vikings, and from this point forward, they can focus on their biggest antagonists, which is their neighbors to the south.
Nope.
Alexander, you would have Alexander III. So this is the younger king. You would have thought that he would have just been a normal king. He has 3 children. Really, he should have just been yet another king in the Chronicles of Scotland. But all 3 of these children fall ill and die very, very young, and all of a sudden he's without an heir again. He does have one granddaughter, but she also dies, I think, at the age of 6 or 7. So just after one stroke of good luck, where this issue with the Vikings is settled, basically due to a very, very lucky storm, you have a stroke of terrible luck where all of the king's heirs just fall sick and die. And then in his attempt to get a newer, younger wife, to hopefully get some new heirs, one dark and stormy night when the king wants to go be with his new bride so they can do what you do to create heirs. Nobody knows what happened, but they just know that they found his body the day after. So he could have probably just hunkered down for the night and waited for the storm to pass, but he had fucking to do.
He didn't want blue balls.
Yep, no he didn't. Where the king died, this is now called the King's Crag. And this creates the power vacuum that the story of Braveheart exists in. This power vacuum that happens when the king's young heirs all die unexpectedly and then he dies himself. This is the kind of power vacuum that's perfect for a fantasy novel or a Mel Gibson movie. Edward Longshanks is the King of England at this point, and he is the villain at the start of the movie Braveheart. If you were to watch that movie, you would think he's just a pagan king who decides to flex his muscles over Scotland for the hell of it. But at this point in the story, Edward gets along with the king, or gets along with the Scots pretty well. Remember, the previous king had married his sister, so he was the brother-in-law of the now deceased king. And when it came to figuring out who was going to succeed the previous king of Scotland, now that the House of Canmore had completely died out, there was no reason to think that he wouldn't be a good guy to arbitrate this dispute, or even if it was a dispute. This is something that's called the Great Cause, is who's going to be the new king of Scotland after the House of Canmore has died out. Traditionally, the people who made these decisions, they were called the Guardians with a capital G. With the French nobility and French traditions coming in, you'll notice that there was a lot less cousins killing cousins at this point.
We're making progress.
We're making progress, but now that everybody's dead, there still is no established way to determine who the new king is. Two of the major landowning families in Scotland at this point are the Bruce family and the Balliol family. The King of England, Edward Longshanks, he says, everybody who has a claim on the throne of Scotland, I want you to come to me. We'll call you the competitors. I think there are 12 or 13 of them. And the King of England said, after me and my wise counselors discuss this over, we're going to decide which one of you people is the king. Really, the only two who have any serious claim on the throne are Robert the Bruce and John Balliol. Now, when I say Robert the Bruce, this is not the guy who eventually becomes the King of Scotland. This is his grandfather.
Okay.
So to distinguish between the two of them, I'm going to call them Bruce the Competitor and just Robert the Bruce. Bruce the Competitor is this grandfather who's competing for the throne.
Okay.
Now, Robert Bruce the Competitor claims he has the strongest claim to the throne because he's only, I think, 2 or 3 generations removed from King David, who was the large landowner who became the King of Scotland and finally united the Celts and the Scots once and for all. But the other guy, John Balliol, he was descended from one of the older brothers, one of the older sons of King David. And whereas in the old days this would just lead to 2 cousins meeting on the battlefield and one cutting the other's head off, there was enough French tradition here to say for the King of England to decide we're going to give it to the guy who descended from the older brother, even though he was, I think, 3 or 4, maybe even 5 generations removed at this point. This very much pisses off the Bruce family, but at the end of the day, everybody around that table, all of the competitors still decide to pledge fealty to the King of England. Some people have issues, though. Why? Because when the King of England calls this parliament or calls this council to decide which of the competitors is going to be the next king, when he decides on John Balliol, he insists that this council be held in the north of England. And interestingly enough, it's not the nobles who have a problem with this, or at least if they do have a problem with it, it's not what kicks off the interesting chain of events. It's actually the clergy.
Okay.
Bishop Wishart of Glasgow, he is the guy who tells the King of England to his face, "We're not doing this in England." This harkens back to what I talked about before in one of those old treaties, and one of the old kings appeals to the Pope, asking the Pope to make sure that he views the Church of Scotland equal to the Church of England and the Church of France. The Scottish clergy just really don't like the idea of an English king making decisions on English soil when they've got the Pope backing them up. And this is what starts a little bit of friction north of Hadrian's Wall. But we also see this is where all the different strata of Scottish society really start to coalesce into one culture, because now you have the royals, the nobles, the clergy, the commoners, all putting their thumbprint on what Scotland really is. And this is where the Scottish national character really starts to arise. But a couple of battles immortalized in a Mel Gibson movie, rightly or accurately or inaccurately, certainly don't hurt when it comes to creating national mythology.
A lot more people are going to watch a movie than they're going to read history, unfortunately.
Yep.
It's just the species that we are.
Yep. So John Balliol, after all of this, is crowned at Scone, on the Stone of Destiny. So just as a nice little reminder that even though the King of England was arbitrating this, there's really no tradition that said this coronation is any different than two medieval kings carrying a blood-soaked crown to Scone and getting the Earl of Fife to stick it on his head. In exchange for the King of England saying that John Balliol is going to be the King of Scotland, he expects certain concessions. And John Balliol, or now King John I, essentially becomes a vassal of England. He can't take a piss without the King of England giving him approval for it first. Which again, kings are vassals of other kings. There's nothing necessarily unusual about this until the king decides that he wants to invade France and says to the Scots, well, because you're my vassal, you're going to send your army along as well. And this really rubs the Bishop of Glasgow the wrong way, because he's not just Scottish, he's from Glasgow. And once again, he says, "Fuck you!" He doesn't just say "fuck you," he decides to, in secret, convene a council of 12 people, both clergy, bishops, and nobility, lords. And they decide that they're going to put their foot down and say, we're in charge here, we don't answer to the king. This is important because lest we forget that kings in the Middle Ages didn't believe in the divine right of kings. Kings knew full well that they needed the support of the nobility if they didn't want to get their heads cut off. And the nobility of Scotland and the clergy of Scotland made the decision that they weren't going to support the king anymore if he was just going to go along with the King of England's plans to invade France. If the King of Scotland wanted to keep his head, he really needed to listen to the Scottish nobles. Now, how did he get himself out of this conundrum, or at least how did he try to get himself out of this conundrum? Well, the King of England wanted him to march an army against France, so he sent a delegation over to France to create a military alliance, saying if one of our countries gets invaded by the English, the other country agrees to invade England. So Edward Longshanks raises his army against France. He does get some Scottish nobility giving him support, But after he invades France, the Scottish say, well, we have an alliance with them, so I guess we've got to invade you now. And the Scottish try to invade both Carlisle and Northumberland yet again.
As a dog returning to its vomit.
So the king turns coat and turns on the King of England, and the King of England is really not happy about this, and he says, I gave you the kingship of Scotland in exchange for your fealty, and you're turning on me now? Mm-hmm. This is where the Scots really start to view the King of England as an oppressor. They start to view Edward Longshanks as the enemy.
Now, I study psych, or I did.
Mm-hmm.
If you want to get the worst behavior out of people, what you do is you instill a victim complex. That's just you know.
Well, but keep in mind everything I've just said here. The Scots were the ones who started it.
Doesn't matter. The Germans started World War I.
That they did. Well, okay, I think it was some Slavic nationalist who started World War I, but yes. But Slavs are also a great example of a victim complex.
Yeah, exactly.
So Balliol decides he wants to keep his head. He gets on board with this new Council of 12, and he invades north of England yet again. Invades Carlisle. They're 0-4 or 0-5 at this point. I've lost count. I guess maybe it'll be differently this time. But there's one other thing that we need to bring up here. The Bruce family, the ones who feel slighted because they were passed over for the kingship of Scotland, they decide not to give men to the cause. They decided not to provide an army to the King of Scotland as he decides to invade the English people. So they, this is, if the rest of the Scottish nobility are saying "fuck you" to the English, the Bruce family, they say nope, we're on the English side. They get kicked out of Scotland for this trouble, but because they had pledged their fealty to the King of England during the Great Cause, the king decides to give the Bruce family a bunch of land in the north of England. The movie Braveheart shows Robert the Bruce, who is again the grandson of the guy we're talking about now, as a guy who, turns coat and betrays the Scottish cause, but eventually ends up as the King of Scotland himself. You got to remember one thing about the Bruce family. They were French nobles. They come into Scotland with King David. They pledge fealty to the King of England. They get kicked out of Scotland into England. They eventually end up back in Scotland. This is just pure Machiavellian self-interest stuff. The idea that the Bruces were a proud family with long roots in Scotland, no. This was a family that was out for their own self-interest, and I just want to make that very, very clear here. After King John Balliol has turned coat and decided to invade England, Edward Longshanks decides to make an example of Scotland. And the Scots are probably right to view this as oppressive, because this, even though they turned back the Romans, and even though they turned back the Anglo-Saxon king, King Edward Longshanks marches north with a gigantic army. And this is kind of a fuck around, find out stage. The Scottish did fuck around, and now they're about to find out, because Berwick, which was a wealthy borough in the south of Scotland, within a week went from having a population of 13,000 to having a population of 5,000. So,
attrition there.
Well, it wasn't just soldiers who made up that 8,000 gap. Next, you had the fall of Dunbar Castle, which really was the final submission. Balliol decided to send King Edward Longshanks a long, groveling letter saying, sorry, we got very poor counsel in our decision to stab you in the back. He turns himself over. He has to sign yet another humiliating treaty, and as part of the find out stage, he has to be paraded around England as a penitent. He's sent to the Tower of London. He's sent to exile in France. The King of England, as I said, he takes the Black Rood, he takes the Stone of Scone, which he decides from now on the English king is going to be coronated on. So, yes, it's probably not completely incorrect to view this as the King of England oppressing Scotland, but in honesty, I can't say that the King of England started this. Unless you want to say asking for the Scottish armies to invade France, he might have crossed a line in doing that, but he was going to make an example of the Scottish king no longer being loyal. Of course, even though the Scottish king was sent into exile, he hasn't died yet. The King of Scotland is just a king in exile, and this is another important part of the story. The humiliation is, though, not complete at that point. After he has stolen these historic Scottish artifacts, he decides to travel the countryside, making sure that every landowner with a few acres of land knows who's boss. He gets his people to create something called, essentially to create a document that he gets every landowner in Scotland, including just every minor farmer, to sign or put his seal on. Gets 1,900 of these. Eventually this long scroll becomes so ragged that it's called the ragged roll or the ragman roll, and the English word, the rigmarole, comes out of this when something's long and complicated. It's because it's got 1,900 seals on this one document. Interestingly enough, though, there's one name that is not on this document, and that name is Wallace. The Wallace family, the patriarch of the family, his name is actually Malcolm Wallace. William Wallace of Braveheart fame is his younger brother. But whoever it was that made the decision not to sign this long scroll pledging fealty to the King of England, whether it was Malcolm or whether it was William, it's hard to believe that it wasn't an intentional choice. It wasn't a way of giving the middle finger to the English, because they did own enough land. Lots of other families who owned comparable amounts of land, they ended up with their names on the ragman roll, but the Wallace family didn't. In the year 1296, Edward goes back to London, and 6 months later, after this total humiliation, the Scots decide to calmly accept their status as a lord. No, they don't. They stop paying taxes.
Okay.
I'm not saying they all stop paying taxes, but enough of them stop paying taxes that for the King of England to be administrating Scotland, he's losing money on it.
What are you, Greeks? Pay up!
Yeah, but I mean, as part of this submission, though, Edward Longshanks does install some of his vassals in Scotland, and one of his vassals is the Bruce family, who had just been kicked out. After being kicked out for refusing to support the Balliol family, after being given all of this land in England, the King of England decides to give them a bunch of land back in Scotland so that they can keep their eyes on the administration of Scotland, shall we say. Now, at this point, the original Robert the Bruce, the competitor, has died, and his grandson, Robert the Bruce, I can't remember if the father's died at this point or not, but he, for whatever reason, decides to join the Scottish Rebellion. The Bruce family, they're just, let's just say they're playing Game of Thrones. Again, it's hard to look at them as being necessarily disloyal, because I don't think they were ever on anybody's side in the first place.
That's the savages. Savages gonna
Oh yeah. Yep. Now, we actually don't know much about William Wallace. The movie Braveheart is based on a poem by a minstrel named Blind Harry, who lived like 2 centuries after him. So I'm sure that the poem of Blind Harry took a lot of liberties, and Mel Gibson took a lot of liberties on top of that. Whatever's true or isn't true in these narratives, we know that William Wallace became a really big pain in the ass for the English. At some point here, he kills the sheriff of Lanark, The poem says he killed the king of Lanark as revenge for the sheriff of Lanark as revenge for killing his wife. Was that true? Who knows? It made for a good, opening act of the movie. But it wasn't just an honorable revenge killing, because after this point he decides to kill every Englishman he can find.
Good idea, and you just take it to an extreme.
Yeah. Well, like about 10 years ago, two British MPs got in a little bit of an argument in the pub within the British Parliament buildings, and it ended up with the Scottish MP headbutting the English MP. So some of these things go back a long way. Yeah, so William Wallace at some point gathers up an army of commoners, or I should say a militia of commoners, and they launch an attack on Scone, i.e. the capital of Scotland. And the English minister escapes with his life, but there's a lot of gold in the abbey or the building wherever he was doing his business from. And now William Wallace doesn't just have a ragtag army of peasants who don't like the English, they also have a war chest.
War is expensive.
War is very expensive, but it's a lot cheaper when you have a bunch of crazy peasants who are willing to do it for pride.
Yeah, you can do it very cost effective. If you can get, the Scottish Catholics.
Well, trained soldiers are expensive,
Yep.
Peasants are cheap.
Yep, and renewable.
Yep. Vladimir Putin has that,
Exactly.
I think, very...
Down to a science.
Yeah, I think that's his philosophy. Bishop Wishart, again, the guy who has been the thorn in the king's side for probably years, if not a decade at this point. He also launches another rebellion, as does the Stuart family. The Stuart family is the one that later becomes the main dynasty of Scotland, but I think we're going to end this before we get to the Stuarts. But both Wishart and Stuart both decide to raise, rebellions against the English as well. Unfortunately, they're just not. They don't have the je ne sais quoi of William Wallace. They're not terribly successful in their rebellions either, whereas Wallace, he really is a thorn in the English side. And Wishart was also clergy, though, and the King of England was worried about him more than he was worried about William Wallace. It probably was not the best decision to make, but in the same way that when Martin Luther decides to start shit in Germany, normally the Catholic Church would say, okay, we're going to go deal with this right now. The Catholic Church made a decision at that point, we need to deal with the Habsburg, who just became the Holy Roman Emperor. What's the worst that can happen if we just let this thing in Germany go for a couple of years? In hindsight, it's easy to say. Without hindsight, it's hard. I can't say I would make a different decision myself.
A butterfly flaps its wings,
exactly.
history changes.
Well, just saying, this Wishart is the bishop who's been telling me fuck you to my face, and he's been trying to start shit for years now. Who else are you really going to look at, honestly? As Wallace is training his army, though, they win the battle at Stirling Bridge, and this is really the battle that's the climax of the movie Braveheart. Now, it's called the Battle of Stirling Bridge, and in the movie Braveheart, there's no bridge. So again, maybe it makes for better cinematics, like maybe it makes for a more epic movie scene if you have a big gorge and you have two armies running at each other downhill. In reality, what happened, and I think this probably would have made a better movie, but I'm not Mel Gibson. The Scottish just hid out and waited for the English to start crossing the bridge over one of the rivers beneath Stirling Castle. Now, the code of, I don't know if it was chivalry or if it was pre-chivalry, said, you wait for the other army to get in place, you get your army in place, and then you guys go at each other at the battlefield. While the English army was marching over the bridge, the Scottish just... Which, I'd rather watch a movie about that than watch a movie about a bunch of painted guys in kilts running at each other.
It's a better story.
Yeah, yes it is.
You want to win, folks? Pay attention. This is what winning takes sometimes.
Yes, it does. But, this is what gets the King of England to take his eye off of Bishop Wishart and say, okay, we need to deal with this crazy guy.
Okay. Out of the pool.
Yep. Also, the treasurer, who was the guy who was collecting all of the taxes, so he was the guy who was complaining that running Scotland was losing money for the English king. He happens to be at this battle, and William Wallace makes a belt out of his skin off his back. So
a little bit I know about Scottish history is they're known for flaying their opponents and then hanging the skin up to show everybody who they killed. So
So this guy's one of them. But Wallace makes a belt.
I like it's a practical item. It's not decorative.
Yep. Oh, I'm sure they did lots of decorative stuff as well.
Sure.
There were a lot of people who were killed.
It speaks to a utilitarian culture.
Yes.
Nothing goes to waste.
So, for winning this battle, quote-unquote battle, just storming the English army when they were crossing a bridge, Wallace is made a guardian of Scotland, and the nobles of Scotland turn on a dime.
Yeah.
There were still a lot of them who did support the King of England and still gave him armies to go invade France with.
They don't want to be the next guy.
They don't want to be the next guy, so they all pledged their support to this William Wallace guy. Now, at this point, Edward I decides that he needs to put an end to the Scots himself, because this William Wallace guy has just not just beaten an army, not just beaten him at one battle, he's completely humiliated an army that had a reputation for being able to deal with any little skirmishes, and yet now they were killed. Now they were defeated by a much smaller militia because they couldn't cross a bridge fast enough. He's not going to let this stand.
You can't get your longbow out because there's not enough room on the bridge you're trying to cross.
Yep. Yeah. So Edward just decides at this point that he needs to put an end to the Scots himself. They've pissed him off that much, and also on top of everything, Wallace is pillaging villages in northern England.
Scott's gonna Scot.
But his luck runs out at the Battle of Falkirk. Nobody really knows why, but the cavalry retreat at some point, and the archers are killed to the last man, and Wallace resigns as a guardian. Before he's caught, though, he does visit France to try to call in to see if the French are willing to honor this alliance that the Scottish formed with them to invade the English in the first place.
The French said, "Ha! You're serious?"
Yeah. The most charitable reading is that the French were involved in a couple of other wars at the time, but for whatever reason, the French leave the Scots out to dry.
Get the curd treatment.
Eventually, after 7 years, Wallace is captured. He's taken down to England, and the one accurate part of Braveheart is how he was tortured and killed at the end of it.
Mel Gibson has incredible attention to detail when it comes to torture.
He does.
He's not gonna miss anything.
He was drawn and quartered, and all four quarters were taken to different parts of Scotland so that people had an idea of what happens when you get on the English's bad side. But I don't think the Scottish really worry too much about being on the English's bad side, at least not from what I've observed. So, after the Battle of Falkirk, after Wallace is defeated, Wishart and Robert Bruce, they decide to take the knee and pledge fealty to the King of England, or at least pretend they pledge fealty to the King of England. They've both, in different ways, got ulterior motives here. But again, Robert the Bruce, I mean, I don't know how many times he changes sides. I don't know why somebody doesn't just send him to the gallows after changing sides one too many times, but he has a silver tongue and
Very charming.
Yep. This brings us to the question. This brings up a question. Now that William Wallace has been defeated, and now that now that the Scottish nobility has decided, enough is enough, we're going to at least publicly pledge fealty to the King of England. Why didn't Scotland just become a northern province of England? Why did they still end up as an independent kingdom? And this is where the real intrigue starts. I know we're well over an hour into this, but this is the part of the story that really gets yada yada in Braveheart. You have a battle where William Wallace loses, and then yada yada yada. The King of Robert the Bruce becomes King of Scotland. There's a lot of intrigue that gets yada yada over here. The first is that Robert the Bruce and John Comyn are large landowners on both sides of the border. Now, Bruce and Comyn are both descendants of the competitors who were around that table when Edward decided who to make the king. So they both have some claim on the throne, or at least they both feel like they have some claim on the throne. Bishop Wishart, the Bishop of Glasgow, he's been brought to heel, but you haven't heard the last of him yet. And remember, he's the guy who kind of started all this mess by telling the king, I don't like the fact that you're having this council in England, and B, creating this other council in secret that wasn't going to listen to the king. Behind the king's back, Wishart, the Bishop of Glasgow, and the Bishop of St. Andrews as well, they decide to start scheming. You're defeating William Wallace at a battle the king thought he'd finally dealt with the Scots, but the Scottish people are just too much of a pain in the ass for that. Those treaties that I mentioned in the backstory, these absolutely come into play here, because when Richard the Lionhearted had sold Scotland independence back, the Scottish bishops had gotten assurances from the Pope, or the Pope Clement III at the time, that the Scottish Church reported directly to Rome, not to the King of England. So the Church absolutely has a vested interest in keeping Scotland independent, because if Scotland becomes just a province of England, then there's no more Church of Scotland. So, yeah, this is important when you're reading history from the Middle Ages or the late Middle Ages, is that the Church just isn't a place where people go to confess their sins. The Church is a serious political player, and they complicate this story quite a bit here. But back in the 1300s, where we left the story, King John Balliol, he's still not dead yet. He's still living in exile, and he's living under the custody of the Pope. So what do the Scottish clergy do under the nose of the English king? They send a delegation to go visit the Pope and argue that John Balliol is still the legitimate king. The Pope agrees. The Pope lets Balliol free, and the Scottish clergy think, okay, this is great, we're going to get our king back, and we're going to remain independent, or at least he's going to be able to keep fighting for our independence. There's only one little problem here. remember how I said that the Scottish nobles were all French aristocrats?
Yep.
This guy's family still has a bunch of land in France, and he says, you know what? Do I really want to go back to the Scottish moors, a rainy, miserable place, and fight the King of England? Why don't I just spend the rest of my days on my family's land in France?
Smart man.
Yeah, France is beautiful. France is sunny. Scotland is full of people who have a much shorter temper than the people in France do.
Even in Paris.
So after all of this work going to get the old King of Scotland released, he just doesn't want to come back. And they're like, oh shit, what do we do now?
Tell me your country's unpleasant without telling me
Well-
your country's unpleasant. Just let your rulers just, no, fuck that, I'm just staying.
The other thing that happens is that the Pope declares himself the supreme authority over any other king in Europe, and this causes the King of France to declare war on the Pope. So the bishops just aren't really going to have much of a good time getting the Pope to intervene in their little political disputes when the Pope is at war with the King of France. This is also, again, talking about the bigger picture of history in Europe. This is also when the papacy moves from Rome to Avignon for a little bit. Just, these events don't happen in a vacuum. Now, when I say that things are a little bit different when you have a literate nobility because ideas can spread, the Scottish clergy come up with a plan B because of this. Because one of the most famous theologians of his day is actually a Scottish guy who lives in Paris. His name is John Duns Scotus. And he makes a theological argument right around this time that the idea of consent ultimately lies behind royal authority. These days, every single political theory talks about this. This is a completely new idea at the time. Now, was this just a really brilliant theologian coming up with an idea after spending his time scratching his head in the ivory tower? Well, there is not really any evidence that when the Scottish delegation went to go meet the Pope, that one of them met this guy. But if the journey goes through Paris en route to Rome, and a Scottish theologian in Paris immediately writes this paper saying that that a king needs to have legitimacy, you put two and two together here. Even though we have no evidence that the Scottish delegation met this guy, there is a very, very good chance they met this guy. And this is very, very important because when the old king decides, fuck it, I want to stay in France, now the Scottish clergy has an argument to say, well, this king is derelict in his duty, so we can find a new king now, and we have the backing of the church to do so. Like everything else, this idea of consent of the governed, consent of the masses, we like to think it was maybe something from the American Revolution or from, from the English Civil War or from a lot of struggles between the peasants and the upper classes. It really just came down to a convenient political move.
As always.
As always, yep. Now, this delegation comes back to Scotland with this consent argument in their pocket. And in the year 1304, there's a parliament or some sort of congress that meets in Scotland to just deal with the usual affairs of the day. Robert the Bruce happens to be present at this. Why wouldn't he be? He's a major noble who has pledged his fealty to the king, so why wouldn't he be present at this little congress? But the Bishop of St. Andrews pulls him aside for a secret meeting at Cambus Kenneth Abbey. Cambus Kenneth Abbey. Say that 3 times fast.
I can't.
So the Bishop of St. Andrews agrees that if you make a bid for the throne, we'll support you. Now, the King Edward Longshanks, he's an old man at this point. He's old and frail. It's just only a matter of time until he dies. So the clergy just tell Robert the Bruce, please just hold off. This old man's going to die. As soon as he dies, there's going to be a huge power vacuum, and we're going to support you when you want to coronate yourself as the King of Scotland and finally get rid of the Balliols once and for all. Unfortunately, the Bruces weren't the only family with their eyes on the crown. There was the Comyn family, who I mentioned earlier, and they were, I think, related to the line of the family where the Balliols came from as well. So they said if the Balliols had the legitimate right to get the crown of Scotland and they want to give up the crown, we should get the crown, right? So again, there's going to clearly be some sort of a power vacuum when the old King of England finally dies, right? You would think. That's not how things work in Scotland. Because the king calls another Congress at Dumfries, and even though the Bishop of St. Andrews has told Robert the Bruce at this point, look, we will support you over the Comyns, don't worry. Just to make sure, Robert Bruce calls Comyn to a secret meeting at the Greyfriars Church, ostensibly so that Bruce could offer the Comyn family just some land in exchange for saying, look, you support me for the king to wear the crown, and we will let you have even more land. You'll be an even more powerful noble. But Robert the Bruce just stabs Comyn in true Scottish fashion. Actually, that's not true Scottish fashion. Here's true Scottish fashion. He runs out of the church saying, I killed him! I killed him! And one of his, one of the people who's loyal to him, his name is Robert Kirkpatrick, runs in and says, I'll make sure. And the family crest of the Kirkpatrick family has the words, I'll make sure on it. So...
Fascinating culture.
And as I said, this is where the Scottish culture that starts to look like our modern Scottish culture starts arising. The first hour of this, I was just talking about kings killing kings. It could have just been a generic episode of Game of Thrones. This is definitely Scottish stuff going on here.
The flavor of Scotland.
So, King Edward is on his deathbed at this point. He really... they could have just waited for him to die. The bishops were probably unhappy with Robert the Bruce killing his rival for the crown. But now that the deed is done, they've basically got to give him the crown.
Yep.
And the King Edward, he says, how are they going to crown him? We still have the coronation stone. Well, it doesn't really matter. They still give him the crown anyways.
We got so many fucking stones.
Yeah, basically. The king is just so fed up with the Scottish people's shit at this point that he says even though he's frail and on his deathbed, he raises another army to invade Scotland. Like, it's almost like something, how in the Bible, Moses never makes it to the promised land. He dies in sight of the promised land. Yep. The guy literally dies in sight of the river into Scotland. I wouldn't say this is quite a Deus Ex Machina because they've given him an ulcer for decades at this point. So this isn't just something out of the blue, but it was another just moment of luck that they had.
Convenient timing.
Yeah. Now, Edward tells his son, Edward II, who's the heir to the throne, like, please finish these people off for me. These people are just...
These people are a scourge. They've been a scourge since the time of the Romans. We
Now,
have to put an end to it. I picture like a Mr. Leahy finally stumbling up and he's going to finally kill Julian. Ricky.
Now, it's interesting you say Mr. Leahy. That's actually not a bad thing to bring up. A few words about Edward II. Now, in the movie Braveheart, he's portrayed as a really flaming homosexual. Mel Gibson got some shit for that, but it's not the only thing Mel Gibson's gotten shit for in Hollywood. a little bit of buggery happens in royal courts.
Yeah,
This is
especially
not...
in the British Isles. That's
Yeah. This is not necessarily unheard of, the fact that he was known for having some tryst. He wants his buggery. Edward II, though, did something that really got him on the bad side of the English nobles. It's that he had buggery with commoners. Speaking of Mr. Lee, there was a famous story of like him having the company of some sailors for 4 days. Like, this is what...
that was the bridge too far.
Yeah, well, no. So it's in those days, like, you wouldn't identify as a homosexual. It's just you engaged in a bit of buggery because you were you were into hedonism. It's really all it was about.
It's like identifying as like a usurer.
Yes.
Like it's something you do. It's
exactly.
Not, it wasn't an identity. It wasn't,
exactly.
It was just something that decadent and vicious people did.
Yeah. But so, what really pissed off the nobles in England, though, is one of his little paramours. He asked this guy to partake in the coronation ceremony.
No.
And you're not supposed to get a commoner to do that, let alone a commoner who's only in the room because he's spreading his ass cheeks for you.
They're rubbing our faces in it.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, the guy's name is Piers Gaveston. If you want to want to know a little bit more about the history of...
Sounds like a gay porn star.
Yeah. So this is the guy who just inherited the throne of England, and he's sometimes portrayed in history as just a really weak king. That probably goes along with the homosexuality. That's not necessarily a fair picture of him. But compared to his father, he was not a guy who was going to spend his whole life just raising bigger and bigger armies just to try to deal with this one thorn in his side. It just wasn't his personality. Again, Edward Longshanks, the old man, he had marched an army all the way north while he was literally dying. He dies right before they cross the river into Scotland. The new, young, probably overly handsome, faced king. He goes into Scotland, just makes a little bit of a round, says, you give loyalty to me, you pledge loyalty, you pledge fealty to me, right? Yeah, sure, all right, good, everybody give me fealty, I'm going back to London. So this is another stroke of luck for Robert the Bruce, is that he gets a little bit of breathing room. This is not to say that Edward is not going to be back. He is going to be back, but for a couple of years, Robert can deal with matters, within his own realm. But he still has a couple of issues that he has to deal with. First of all, he just got excommunicated for killing the other guy to take the throne. The Pope didn't like that all that much, even though he was supported by the local bishops. Even though his crown is secure, at least as far as Scotland goes, if he's really going to be a proper king of Scotland, he still needs other royals to recognize that he's legitimate, or that he's the sovereign king of Scotland. I can declare myself the king of Siam right now. I guess, A, the country of Siam doesn't exist, but B, if I don't have the Siamese people
backing you up.
Well, if I don't have the Siamese people backing me up, and if I don't have other world leaders recognizing that I'm the king, what difference does it really make?
Like that guy who, I forget if it was Idi Amin who declared himself king of Scotland.
Yep. Yeah. So you got to remember, though, that the English still hold several castles in Scotland. So on paper, the King of Scotland is still a vassal of the King of England. So even though Robert gets a little bit of breathing room, he still has to raise an army and start to kick the English out. And this is where he gets the wrath of the young King Edward II. He fails at first, and Edward kills a bunch of his loyal men, as you do, and he takes his wife and sister, puts them in cages, publicly displays them in London. He's a homosexual, so maybe I'm sure there's something
theatrical.
Yeah. probably does have the flair for the theatrics. He sends Robert's daughter to a convent. Puts his wife under house arrest. So Robert's not in the best position right now. As like 6 months after getting crowned King of Scotland, he has to just disappear, and nobody really knows what happens in this 6 or 7 months. He just completely disappears off the face of the earth, and there's no record of it. There's a famous story, if we want to talk folklore or the legends that people tell themselves. Now, this story doesn't enter the imagination until centuries afterwards. The story is that Robert the Bruce is hiding out in a cave and sees a spider trying to spin a web, and every time the spider tries to jump across the mouth of the cave, it fails, and eventually it jumps from one side to the other and starts spinning its web. So again, as the legend goes, this is what inspires Robert to not just spend his life in exile and go back and try to A, get his family out of the cages, and B, try to assert his regal authority once and for all. Again, there's no evidence any of this stuff happened. We just know that he disappeared off the face of the earth for about half a year.
He was finding himself.
Yes. The first thing he does is he comes back, he raises a small army, and they score a victory at Loudon Hill. Now, the victory of Loudon Hill against the English army, it's very kind of similar to William Wallace's victory. It was using some, let's say, less than chivalrous means. They got there a couple days earlier, dug some ditches, put some spikes underneath them, and covered it with grass and vines so nobody could see them. And as the English army was marching into place, some people fall through these pits, and this crazy Scottish guys chase them off as they don't know what happened.
It's like freaking orcs.
Yeah, basically. That's Hitler. When Hitler got to the Western Front, he was expecting to be dealing with a bunch of effete Englishmen, and saw a bunch of these people just coming over the hill. It's probably exactly the same thing that the English were dealing with at this point. So, in addition to making the English cut and run at yet another battle, Robert also takes on the Comyns. He did kill the one guy at the church, but as tribal politics go, you kill one guy, you've got a whole bunch of family members who are out for blood.
Yep.
He manages to subdue the Comyns by force. It wasn't pretty, but even though the Comyns had more land than he did, he was able to raise an army and make sure that they weren't going to be challenging him for the crown anymore. And probably because the bishops were politicking behind the scene, the Pope lifts the excommunication at this point.
It's into heaven again. Okay, good.
Yeah. Oh yeah, completely slaughtering everybody on a family's land to make sure they can't challenge you, that's...
It gets you back into the good graces of the Pope in this epoch.
Yep. Well, in the year 1309, you have a document called the Declaration of the Clergy, which says that the people have, quote-unquote, chosen the king. Again, this is something we take for granted now that you see this kind of language in a lot of political documents. This is, as best as I know, the first of a kind, the first time that, you talk about the king ruling in the names of the people. Now, first question is, what does the people mean? The people means a couple of clergymen and a couple of nobles. But they at least say they're they have to, the king at least is going to say he's governing in the name of the people from this point forward. Practically speaking, the king is going to say he's doing things in the name of the people, and the clergy are going to tell the people what they want. But yeah, that's just the way consent is always created. And the idea that anything is really bottom up is fantasy more than anything else.
We're not a bottom-up species.
No, we're not. Edward II, on the other hand, as I said, at this point, the English king still doesn't recognize Robert's legitimate claim to, or as a sovereign monarch. Some nobles are still not loyal to him yet. Either they're loyal to the Comyn family or they're still loyal to the deposed Balliol family, because tribal shit. And the biggest problem is that he doesn't have a male heir. Now, there's lots and lots of fighting that culminates at Stirling again and at a little creek called the Bannockburn. It's a tributary of the Forth River. This is where Edward II's army is defeated. Now, this is the final scene of Braveheart, where, at least according to the popular myth, this is where the Scots finally get their independence from England. And in reality, no. This is just yet another pain in the ass for the English throne. It's no different than any of the other battles that the Scottish have won up to this point that just give people headaches down in London. But nevertheless, it is a decisive victory in the same place that William Wallace won his battle a couple of decades earlier. And it's a decisive victory that you can build a story around. Once again, it's all about building the popular myth that people are going to coalesce around, and having a major decisive victory against your sworn enemies is a pretty good way of doing that. But just in reality, the battle itself didn't really sway anybody into believing that Robert was now the sovereign. But again, and I got to keep going going back to the backdrop of world events. The Crusades are still going on at this point, and the Pope wants all of the major kings to be part of the crusade. I'm not sure which crusade it is at this point, but the Pope says everybody who's going to be a legitimate king has to be marching down to the Holy Land with us as we finally reclaim the Holy Land from the Saracens. And this is kind of a big deal when the King of Scotland is trying to prove that he's an independent king. Both the King of England and the King of Scotland, appeal to the Pope. It's not the most interesting part of the story. They both give their arguments,
My soldiers are too pasty to go to the desert.
Well,
they're going to burn up.
It's more like they literally talk about stuff from the Roman Empire, like they, the English say, we were the people who the Romans civilized. And the Scottish say, I think they say we're one of the lost tribes of Israel or something. I can't remember what
Sounds
they come up with.
right.
But
it's always, you get a group of people that's like lost, there's sooner or later than the lost tribe of Israel. It's just like...
One of the rebuttals to the English king is called, it contains a document called the Arbroath Declaration. And it says things like, Scotland, it doesn't say Scotland's independent, it says Scotland reports to Rome, but it means Scotland doesn't report to England. It uses the same language that I was using, that the previous document uses. It says, by the due consent and assent. And it has a very famous line. Actually, I was in Scotland a couple of years ago, and I went to Arbroath Abbey. I saw the original document. It says, for as long as but 100 of us may remain alive, never will we be brought under English rule. It's a very Scottish sentiment. But B, if the language sounds a little bit familiar, it's because when the Americans wrote their Declaration of Independence, they at least partially use this document as a model for it.
Everything in history is plagiarized.
Yes, it is. Especially telling the King of England to go take a hike. Now, but again, this is just like the Battle of Bannockburn. This is more lore than reality, because the Pope has to deal with a lot of letters from a lot of bishops every day. I'm sure the Pope said, yeah, sure, you got assent and consent, good for you guys. Yeah, you don't like the English. Anyways, we got a crusade to fight here.
We gotta kill some Muslims.
Yep, that they did. Now, Again, in the popular lore, this was the Scottish Declaration of Independence. It was how we finally declared our independence from England. No, it wasn't. Robert the Bruce still isn't viewed as a proper independent sovereign, and he was still going to have to win battles and convince popes and do whatever he needed to do. He, as I said, also is dealing with the other nobles who are not loyal to him. He had to deal with a failed coup attempt at this point. So it kind of sounds like after all of this debunking of Braveheart, we still haven't gotten really anywhere. Still sounds like the Scots are a thorn in the side of the King of England, and the King of England is just not going to give an inch. So
The word that comes to mind is ungovernable.
yes, but what happens here? Well, remember how I said there were 3 major Deus Ex Machinas? Here's where we get the third one.
Okay.
Because remember how I said that the King Edward II was a little bit of a playboy who liked the sample platters sexually, and
You got it.
he didn't get AIDS, but he pissed off a bunch of the nobles, and I mean, his wife knew that she was in a sham marriage with them, so the nobles actually supported his wife, and more specifically, his wife's boyfriend. Yes, that's not an internet meme. They supported his wife's boyfriend to really become the de facto leader of England. They kicked the young queer prince off the throne. He does have a son who they make. He's a kid. They make him the king of England, but he's too young to be a proper ruler, so they put him under a regency. It's literally, the guy becomes a cuck. His wife's boyfriend is the guy who's de facto leading England. And what's the first thing that he does? It's like, I don't want to deal with these Scottish people. Just give them their independence already. And that is how the Scottish people got their independence.
There we go.
And again, just to finally put a button on it, if you want to really put things in the proper context of the events of Europe, the big picture of them, why did they not want to deal with the Scottish anymore? It's because they had 100 Years' War to start fighting. They wanted, the king's wife was a French princess, and she wanted to expand her land, expand her reach, so she, by way of her boyfriend, got the English to raise an army and focus on fighting France, which they would do for the next 100 and some odd years, and just dealing with some quite argumentative people on their northern border. Just, they didn't think it was worth their time anymore. So, as much as, Scottish culture in the year 2024 comes, at least Scottish national pride, a lot of it comes from a Mel Gibson movie in the mid-1990s. As much as the Scottish national mythos revolves around William Wallace at the Battle of Stirling Bridge, and Robert the Bruce, and the Battle of Bannockburn, it came down to the King of England being a fag and getting kicked off the throne.
Yeah, this is what turns the wheels of history, guys.
So, most of my blood is Scottish. I'm proud of my Scottish heritage, but that's just a historical fact.
If after this, if you are you got your personal mythology shattered and you're feeling bad, I just want you to know that in context of every other group of people, the Scottish are doing pretty well. Eventually, they all got literate.
Yep.
It took a fire and brimstone preacher telling them all they were going to hell.
Yep. Well, that's how the Reformation worked in Scotland.
And 100 years later, they were inventing life insurance.
The steam engine.
They were contributing,
Oh yeah, once the Scottish people eventually got educated, they were producing more scientific and engineering and medical discoveries than the English did, at least per capita.
So I think that's where we're going to leave today for Radio Free History, and we'll see you next week.